Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, Mysterious Voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a book that I read, one that is about philosophy and group therapy, which is a strange combination, especially in fiction. And the book I am referring to is The Schopenhauer Cure by Irvin Yalom, which was published in 2005. For those who don't know, Irvin Yalom is a Jewish-American writer who's been writing pretty much since the 1970s, but I say that he's a writer, but first and foremost, he is a psychologist, which makes sense given the subject of today's story. But what I found out is that he's actually one of the foremost people in the field of existential psychology or group therapy. He wrote basically an introductory book for therapists to use in group therapy, and he also wrote a treatise, or like not a treatise, but like a main book on an overview of existential psychology as well, which is pretty cool to be hearing from like one of the big experts in that field. In addition to that, he's also wrote some fiction, mainly focusing on historical figures and having them interact in thought experiments or something like that, which is something you see in this story, kind of writing a fictional story and then like in the larger scope, trying to write a narrative about Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher from the 1800s. So very interesting type of writer, winning a number of awards for his writing, but also for his work in the field of psychology. Very fascinating human being. I personally love the existential psychologists because of what they're really focused on, that deep down we're all scared of death, and that's contributing to our mental health concerns that we're going to therapy for. And one of my favorite books was written by a kind of existential psychologist, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Highly recommend that book. It changed my life in a very big way, and it's just a really high quality book. And I'm very much looking forward to reading other work from Yalom, based on what I've seen here. It's a very strange type of story that he's written, but one that really kept me hooked. Also, I want to let you know that I will end up spoiling the book in the summary section because it's a bit of an older book. So I'm going to recommend this. So if you want to go out and read it, I suggest you do that now and then come back and check out this video so that you're not spoiled too much. But without further ado, let's talk about the Schopenhauer Cure. I will do a summary and analysis, and we will move on from there. So the Schopenhauer Cure focuses on Julius Hertzfeld. He is an aging therapist. His wife died 10 years previously, thereabouts, and his children are present in his life, but they live on their own mostly. And at the start of the story, Julius learns that he has developed a melanoma, and the doctors give him at least 1 year of good health, and a couple of years, suffering from the melanoma, as he deals with that. And Julius is at first like disheartened, wondering if life really meant anything. And then he reads some Nietzsche and feels, oh yes, indeed, it seems to have been a good life where I was actually helping people in therapy. And he starts reflecting more on past patients, specifically thinking about a man named Philip, who came to him for a problem with sex addiction. And despite 3 years of therapy, Julius was never able to fully help Philip. And Philip, as a result, dropped out of therapy, and Julius didn't know what happened to him. But he decides to track down Philip, and finding out that he's become a philosophical counselor, a therapist of sorts that's not really credentialed or anything like that. He finds out that Philip has healed himself in some way, using his therapist, who was Arthur Schopenhauer, which Julius finds weird because Arthur is a philosopher from the 1800s who is long dead. And Philip notes that Julius is struggling with his own things, so he promises to tell Julius the secret of Arthur Schopenhauer and help him learn more about this style of philosophy. in exchange for Julius's supervision, because Arthur wants to move into the field of therapy. Julius isn't content to do that because Philip seems a bit distant, and he feels like he wouldn't be able to connect with other people in therapy. And so instead he offers another deal that he'll agree to do some supervision if Philip goes to the group therapy sessions that he's leading and participates in a way that will make Julius feel better about offering that supervision later. We also see a number of Schopenhauer chapters throughout this story, focusing on the life of Arthur Schopenhauer and a little bit of criticism and critique of his theories, and as well as a guess at how he might have come to them, given his difficulty with his family, his struggles with other people, and just connecting in general, and his overall view that life was pretty meaningless. And we only think about death and how it's a comfort from the misery of life in the end, and just a whole bunch of other thoughts about Schopenhauer there. And while Philip is in group therapy, he talks more about his life, and we see the lives of the other people in the group as well. One person who is absent from this is a woman named Pam, who was part of the group therapy but felt it wasn't really helping her. So she went to a retreat in India and did Vipassana, but she felt that wasn't really helping her in terms of helping her forget about her bad relationships that she was in. And so eventually she returns back to the therapy group. But at this point, we learned that Pam had a past relationship with Philip and isn't happy with him. He was one of the women that he wronged when he had the sex addiction problem. And she notes that even furthermore, like he was a TA and he abused the student-teacher relationship there. And he feels pretty regretful about it, but because of his way of thinking, he's like, oh, that was someone in the past, that isn't me now. And so there's a little bit of difficulty in group therapy that we see progressed throughout the story. The group also starts to discuss Schopenhauer because not Julius, but Philip brings it up quite a bit, discussing how his views are pretty pessimistic, but also how they can be pretty helpful in certain contexts. And the group, over time, reaches core issues largely because they know that Julius has a melanoma, and he's giving everyone like a year left of therapy before they have to move on to something else, because he's going to be dealing with whatever cancer that he might have. But the group does seem to be moving in a positive direction. However, two of the participants reveal that they were in a relationship, which one of them feels was wrong, and it violated the group therapy kind of contract. And they have to deal with all sorts of that going on, and it also might be related to Philip's own behavior. But he does begin to open up emotionally as the story progresses, revealing a little bit more, and also revealing how he kind of developed the Schopenhauer mindset as a way of blocking off his own feelings and his sex addiction. And he has a breakthrough at one point where he says, I feel this way, I'm choosing to see the world this way because I am a miserable monster who's incapable of love and incapable of being loved. And at that point, Pam says, I could have loved you in the past. You are a very beautiful person. And Julius kind of holds on to that, and giving Philip the sort of breakthrough moment that he kind of needs. This is the second to last therapy session, and before they get to the final therapy session, Julius ends up falling into a coma and dying, unfortunately, and people mourn him. But as the story comes to a close, we see that both Philip and Tony have become co-leaders in group therapy. Tony, who was kind of hard and aggressive before, but through group therapy was made softer and more in touch with his feelings. And also, this is a reflection of Julius's own statement that he was leading group therapy by himself, but a co-leader can help you see what you might be missing in these sessions. So it ends on a bit of a positive note there. In terms of analysis, there is quite a bit worth talking about in the Schopenhauer Cure. I feel like an adequate sort of review or even like an in-depth discussion of it would take hours, because there's just so much worth exploring, particularly the life of Arthur Schopenhauer, which is very interestingly explored in this story, and it's sort of guiding our understanding of what's happening in the other narrative, the main narrative of the story. So there might be a few things that I don't catch here or that I don't touch upon, but there's definitely a room to argue for quite a bit in this story. But one of the things that Yalom is talking about in the story is that of the deathbed examination. Sort of a reflection of your life, of what you did and whether or not life was ultimately worth it, and if your life was of value or something like that, which a lot of people have on their deathbed, that sort of reflection on what they did and whether any of it was really meaningful. Julius in this story is dying, and he considers whether his life actually meant anything. And that way, this story is pretty similar to John Williams' Stoner. But whereas Stoner in that story reflects at the end of his life and says, was my mundane life actually worth it? Julius, on the other hand, reflects at the beginning of this story and says, was any of this worth it? First thinking maybe not, but then coming to understand that yes, actually, I managed to help quite a few people in my practice as a therapist, which I loved. So yes, it was meaningful. However, despite the fact that it was meaningful, he still hung up on Philip. He realizes he wasn't able to help him, partially because Philip's sex addiction issue had a bunch of underlying problems that they never got to, and also partially because, as Julius notes later in the story, he was also dealing with the death of his wife and some other sexual hang-ups at the time that may not have made him the best therapist to handle such an issue. But it's clear that Philip becomes somewhat of a white whale for Julius in this story, a Moby Dick of sorts, where he sees that Philip was someone he could not help, and he strives to reach out and see if there's some way that he can help him again. And when Philip reveals that he wants to be a therapist, I think Julius sees that as an opportunity to help him in group therapy. Even though he's not really looking for it, and Philip thinks his life is complete, Julius sees that there's something under the surface that maybe he can sort of help him with. And so his final year is dedicated to helping Philip. His final year is essentially dedicated to a form of redemption, not only for Philip in terms of helping him, become a therapist and becoming the best self he can be, but also a little bit for Julius, because this is one of his bigger failures in the field of therapy, and it's a second chance that not many therapists ever really get. But I do have a question about this. Like, is this a noble goal? Is dedicating your final year noble in terms of sacrificing something within yourself to make the world a better place, even if it is just one person, or in this case, the 5 or 6 people who are in group therapy? And I do think there's a either or kind of answer there, where you could argue that yes, like Philip could be doing anything else, and he chooses to spend this final year helping someone who he wasn't able to help in the past, and in that way, it's very noble, and he's sacrificing like any free time he could be spending in good health. But it's also maybe not so noble. Maybe it's a bit obsessive in that he's instead of moving on from this person that he couldn't have helped, he's choosing to stay focused on him. And even worse, he knows he's going to die at some point. So, what if this therapy takes longer? It's only at the second to last session that he's able to open up Philip emotionally. And it's kind of written as sort of resolving the conflict, but there's still more that Philip needs help with. And he didn't even sort of recommend another therapist to continue the work after Philip and the others in the group were done, or after he died. So it feels a little bit selfish too, but again, Philip is a human being, and I think that's one of the points of the story, is that human beings can be selfish in this way. But what's also funny is how in convincing Philip to come to therapy, Julius he charges Philip, even though this is his request. He's just give me money for treating you in group therapy. It feels kind of weird, although there is a sense of ethics and whatnot, but still pretty weird that he kind of charges him. It's also really interesting, and Yalom does pretty good writing here, when you look at Philip's overall transformation from the time that he met Julius to the time that Julius died, and you see the epilogue in this story. So he essentially goes from this miserable sex-addicted man who recognizes that his sex addiction is providing him misery and not letting him pursue anything else, going from that to an idealized philosophical model of how to live your life, or what seems like the idealized model, because as the story goes on, we learn that there's some hangups there. There's some aspects where living your life according to Schopenhauer is probably not the best thing to do, or it's best to live sort of an eclectic life of different styles, because each different philosophical style has its downsides. And we see in the story how Philip believes that isolation is bliss for him, that keeping himself away from the crowd allows him to live according to the principles of Schopenhauer, but provides him comfort in a way that he wasn't getting when he was around other people and he was dealing with his sex addiction. Allow me to read you an interesting quote from this. Rebecca was the first to respond. "To be so content, to need so little from others, never to crave the company of others, sounds pretty lonely, Philip." "On the contrary," said Philip, "in the past, when I craved the company of others, asked for something which they would not, indeed could not give, that was when I knew loneliness. I knew it very well. To need no person is never to be lonely. Blessed isolation is what I seek." And that's a very interesting quote, getting at, a very valid concern that Rebecca has, one of the members in the group therapy session. But Philip kind of saying, I relied on others in the past and they couldn't give me what I needed. So isolation provides the comfort that I seek. Essentially saying that living according to Schopenhauer's principles, that the world is a miserable place and it's best to live outside of other people because it only distracts you from the life that you want to live. It's in that way Schopenhauer has cured him. But it really seems like Yalom is arguing for that kind of lifestyle, never really countering it in any sort of way, maybe seeming like Philip is correct. But as the story goes on, we see cracks in the world that Philip has created for himself, of accepting who he was in the past and maybe letting emotion come in too, because who wants to feel that emotion? And it's pretty simple to see, he might have done that, but he never addressed any of the problems that were underlying, which is deeply unfortunate for him. And the bigger question is, could this life that he's created for himself, could this mindset work as a therapist? And I want to say no. I practiced to be a therapist, or I took a couple classes in counseling grad school, which didn't work out for me, but that's beside the point. And it highlighted the need for the therapeutic relationship, of connecting with another person, with your client, in a way that makes them feel heard and allows them to relate to someone as they're dealing with their concerns. So Philip's mindset can't really work for him in therapy, and Julius is right for pointing this out. There's a need for human connection, and if you're relaying your thoughts to your therapist and your therapist is merely quoting philosophy at you, you're not going to really feel heard in that process, and then you're going to go seek another therapist who is a better social component, has a better ability to connect with you. It's also creating a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy for Philip, where he distances himself from humans and inhibits his social skills. And then when he interacts with people, he tells himself, this is only making me miserable. These people don't know how to communicate with me. Therefore, I need to distance myself further. A self-fulfilling prophecy that just creates a circle of affirming what you have created for yourself. The world that you perceive is true, when actually it's probably not true. It's merely the life that you created for yourself. And it creates additional social problems and additional isolation, which is not really healthy for human beings. I think multiple characters in the story mention that, proving that Yalom is arguing for that path, that creating this kind of life for yourself is not healthy. And allow me to read you another quote from this. Pam turned to address him directly. "Your solution to your problems is a pseudo-solution. It's no solution at all. It's something else. It's a relinquishment of life. You're not in life. You don't really listen to others. And when I hear you speak, I don't feel I'm listening to a living, breathing person." Kind of noting the problems that come from enveloping yourself in this philosophical mindset. And also the problems that would come with being a therapist when people don't feel like they're talking to a human being rather than just a robot. So Yalom cites the need for compassion and actual social connection. And what's also interesting is where the title comes into play, where one of the people in the group therapy session tells Philip that, like, because of your sex addiction, you turned to Schopenhauer, the Schopenhauer cured, but now you need to be saved from the cure. Like, it was helpful to a point, and now it's no longer helpful for him. It hasn't fully addressed the underlying emotional problems, the underlying past traumas that he's trying to run away from. You can see a connection with logic and emotion. Logic by itself will not really help you. And Philip's breakthrough in the story is especially powerful as he basically says, I'm a monster. I don't know if I can be loved. I don't know if I can love. Like, all of this is hurting me, and I don't want to feel it. That's why I've turned to Schopenhauer. And for the people in the group not to judge him, but to love him and support him in this important moment for him shows, why there's a need for social connection. You can't simply rely on yourself alone. I also like Yalom's use of Schopenhauerian analysis in this story, or Schopenhauerian critique, basically taking the life of Arthur Schopenhauer from start and to finish, examining all sorts of aspects from the books he published, the philosophical tenets that he spread, like his upbringing and his trouble with his family, his disconnect from others, and like showing that to the reader and then implementing it within the story. I think it's a very useful way of writing a story. It's certainly different than anything I've really explored previously, because it's just not how people typically write stories. You have to be somewhat of a counselor, like a group therapist type person, in order to really think of writing a story that way. And in that way, the story does feel like a little bit like a thought experiment. Again, the characters are particularly well written, and like I feel like I'm learning a lot about them and their histories, but it still feels like a thought experiment where you're taking Schopenhauer's work and putting it into a story, mixing group therapy, the principles of psychology and philosophy, something that you would read in a school textbook more so than an actual story. And that's not necessarily a problem, but it does come across that way, which might make it difficult for some people to get into. There's other great things about this. As I said before, this is a beautiful display of group therapy. Again, I was in a counseling grad program. I saw the principles of group therapy. I'm very knowledgeable about that. And I'm like, hey, that's a very well done integration into the story. So I have to give Yalom credit for that. And then also a focus on existentialism and whether life is meaningful and what death means overall. That's always something that I really enjoy reading and seeing involved in a story, like with the works of John Williams. So definitely, if you like existentialism, you'll probably like this story. Of course, there's also some not so good elements of this story. Julius dies pretty suddenly in this story. Like after the second to last group therapy session, it's like Julius falls into a coma and dies. And it just feels rather sudden, no chance for the characters to say goodbye. And it felt like that, Yalom doesn't really have a more effective way to end the story, because I do think there could have been a very effective way to integrate all these ideas and have a better death scene for Julius. It also feels vaguely sexist. There's not a lot for the woman characters in the story to really do, and it feels like there's a little bit of women hating going on, like not overt but subtle in a way that's like it gnaws at me and is like, this feels very weird how he's choosing to portray these women. It's a lot of focus on their sex lives and whatnot, which is something you would probably do in group therapy, but it's still noticeable to the point where I have to acknowledge it. And then, again, if this feels like a thought experiment, but also the dialogue is kind of wonky, especially in the beginning of the story, where it feels like these characters are saying things that no actual human being has ever said before. Maybe Yalom has said these things, but it doesn't really feel like relatable dialogue, or it's stuffy academic type writing from someone who refuses to compromise and write to a general audience. And so in that way, I feel like not a lot of people will really get into this story, because it's really hard, especially in the beginning. Once you get into the groove, the story feels much better, and the progression from there is really hooking, and like it really gets you into it. But it's really easy to see that the dialogue feels a bit unnatural at times, and again giving way to that whole thought experiment where this is intended to be written as sort of multiple people kind of having a dialogue and a philosophical examination, more so than a fictional study of actual kind of people who might exist in the world. Anyway, those are my thoughts on The Schopenhauer Cure by Irvin Yalom. A pretty amazing story. Definitely a late contender, really, really late at this point at the time that I'm talking, for a year-end contender. It probably won't end up on the list for the reasons that I mentioned at the end, especially the whole thought experiment and dialogue component, but it's still a really good story that it's probably going to be on my mind for quite some time. So I do recommend it to you out there. I feel like your life will be richer for having read this book, whether you might connect with the ideas displayed, or it might just be the case that you're reading a story that you might not encounter that often in the world, which is always important to get a diversity of reading experiences. So definitely seek this out if you can. I promise it'll be pretty good. But yeah, if you have any thoughts about this or you want to say something about my review here, do so in the comments below. Let's have a discussion about this. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, or subscribe so that more people can find out about this book or this author if they do not already know. Also, join the Discord if you want to have further discussions on psychology, group therapy, media, or whatnot. Basically, the ideas that are present in this story. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and philosophical travels. Farewell.